All of them are carved from the tusks of the walrus in the second half of the 12th century, somewhere in Scandinavia, probably Norway. The chessmen comprise part of a hoard of 93 walrus ivory objects found at some point before April 1831 on the Isle of Lewis, from which they take their name, in the Outer Hebrides off the western coast of Scotland. The belt buckle and 14 ivory counters, probably used in a game similar to backgammon, were found with them. Most of the hoard was acquired by the British Museum between November 1831 and January 1832, but 11 further pieces turned up, unknown to the British Museum. Their existence was unknown to the British Museum. They turned up and were acquired ultimately by the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh in 1888. They are now probably generally regarded now as the most famous chessmen in the world. And what I'd like to explore today is a single facet of their character, but one that indisputably underpins their appeal to a modern audience. From the moment of their discovery, they were considered to be curiosities. Colloquial accounts of the find describe a peasant stumbling upon them in a sand dune in Uig Bay, who, seeing an assemblage of elves or gnomes, fled in terror at what he believed to be the pygmy sprites of Celtic folklore. His bolder wife forced him to return and to scoop them up. The story was related by Daniel Wilson in 1851 and was published in his survey of the archaeology and prehistoric annals of Scotland. The human qualities of the chessmen, they are and have been considered to be, as Wilson's account demonstrates, little people, combined with their universal understanding of the game of chess, conspire to make them the most popular touring exhibits of all of the British Museum's treasures. And although the Cloisters is uniquely privileged to show more than have previously been lent overseas, smaller delegations of the chessmen have travelled to Canada, Australia, India, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Italy, and Spain. And that's just to name the ones that I can remember. So they're really probably more well-travelled than any of us here in this room. So what is the essence of their enduring global appeal? Most modern audiences find it impossible to look upon them without smiling. Many commentators feel that they constitute rare examples of that elusive human impulse, humour. So this afternoon I'm posing the question, how comic are the Lewis chessmen? So to explain my opening slide, this illustration of Homer Simpson as a Lewis chess king, beautifully drawn by the British Museum's illustrator Craig Williams, was inspired by a review of the Game of Kings in the New York Times by Ken Johnson, and that was published on the 17th of November last year. He likened the bug-eyed chessmen to the Simpsons in the following passage. If, by some typically improbable turn of events, Homer Simpson were to unearth from his backyard an old chest containing a chess set from medieval times, what would the pieces look like? Chances are they would resemble the lovable little contestants, beautifully carved from walrus tusks by anonymous artisans in the famous cache known as the Lewis chessmen. He goes on to say, except for the pawns, which are shaped like tombstones and domed-topped octagonal towers, each king, queen, bishop, knight, and warder, as rooks used to be called, has the bug-eyed, stupefied expression of a Simpson. They could be Homer's ancestors. So I'm showing this slide really as a way of demonstrating that our view of historic artifacts and our points of reference to them is inevitably coloured by our own more recent experiences. Occasionally, these observations may lead us to a better understanding of the past by underlining that not much has changed, that our ancestors were governed by the same instincts that make us laugh, play, cry, and grieve today. But how do we interpret a juxtaposition such as this? Craig's reworking of Homer Simpson was modelled on the Lewis chess king, shown on the right. And you can see the obvious similarities in the protuberant eyes, the overbite of the top lip, and a generally linear rendering of facial details. But does this necessarily imply that figures rendered in this way were always perceived as comic? What it may mean, oddly, is that the graphic artists responsible for The Simpsons have imbibed rather more than they might realise from the world of the 12th century in terms of a certain economy of expression. The two products, however, have probably sprung from very different intentions. The cute factor of the Lewis Chessmen, quite understandably, provokes a strong interest from children. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone that secured for them a new worldwide fan base. Here, Harry and Ron pit their wits against one another in a game of wizard's chess. The scene in the film featured a facsimile Lewis chess set owned by my colleague Irving Finkel from the British Museum's Middle East Department. And this following clip from the film is shown by kind permission of Warner Brothers.
That's totally barbaric. That's wizard's chess.
Well, you get the idea. I mean, it is an absolutely captivating feature of the film. It's brilliant. And the relevance of the scene is that it relies for its comic power on an emotional response to the Queen's appearance. The Lewis chess queens, with their chins resting in their hands, are most usually viewed as grumpy, bored, perhaps suffering from toothache. But how correct is this interpretation? I'd like to share with you one further modern take on the chessmen before I look a little more closely at them as 12th century creations. This particular piece has a very special place in my affections. It represents an infantryman, a foot soldier, which within the context of the Lewis chess pieces takes the place of the modern rook. He's very special because of all the chessmen, he's the only one not to have a fully frontal stance. As you can see, he's turning slightly to one side. This endows him with a vulnerability that the other pieces don't have. It suggests a certain hesitancy, perhaps even a desire to be elsewhere. This emotional dimension was observed by two British animation filmmakers in the 1950s, Peter Firmin and Oliver Postgate. They christened this particular chessman Noggin and built around him the BBC TV series Noggin the Nog, which was broadcast in Britain for around 40 years. Now, again, with kind permission from the Firmin and Postgate estate, the following film clip documents how the chessmen were perceived by these artists.
Of the north, where the black rocks stand guard against the cold sea. In the dark night that is very long, the men of the Northlands sit by the great log fires, and they tell a tale. They tell how a prince built a long ship, and sailed in it beyond the black ice at the edge of the world, to bring home his bride from the land of the midnight sun. Noggin the Nog was the name of the prince, young and strong and fair as the men of the Northlands are. And he was the son of Canute, king of the Nogs, the ruler of this land of dark forest and snow. This land of mountains and valleys, of deep narrow bays where the sea roars between the black rocks and the wind howls cold in the night. There was the little town of wooden houses, clustered by a bay where the sea was calm. And there above it was the small castle, the castle of King Canute. Now, every morning as the sun rose, King Canute put on his crown and took his morning walk up the steep path beside his castle to the rock above the town, the rock which was known as Canute's seat. There he sat, and as the sun rose behind the mountains to melt away the black clouds of night, King Canute would begin to worry. He would look down on the harbour and the little wooden houses, and he would worry about his people, and what they would eat in winter, and whether their roofs leaked, and whether they had warm socks this cold weather. He would look down on his castle and worry about his queen Gunhilda, and who would look after her when he died, for he was a very old king and not at all well. And then he would think of his son Noggin, and he would worry about Noggin, because it was the custom in the Northland that the king should be married. And if Noggin had not chosen a maiden to be his queen within 6 weeks of his father's death, then he could not be king.
That's great. Well, I have to say I'm extremely grateful to Steve and the audiovisual unit for managing to get that clip embedded into the presentation today, because my mission would not have been complete if I hadn't exposed an American audience to the joys of Noggin the Nog. And you can see exactly what the appeal of this is, and really how these brilliant filmmakers engaged with the Lewis Chessmen. Now, I think that that clip was wonderfully redolent of the Norse world in a sense, because it almost participates in the ancient tradition of oral storytelling that they describe. And the inspiration of the artwork provided by the chessmen is clear as this slide demonstrates. It shows Peter Firmin's drawing of Canute placed alongside the heavily bearded chess king from the Lewis Horde. And this is as telling as with the Harry Potter episode that features the angry queen, that the king is portrayed in the film as being anxious. I love the line where he's anxious about whether they've got warm socks to wear in the winter, you know. So this, somehow this anxiety is being transferred onto these little pieces. Now, I've included the next slide to make the same point explicitly in relation to Noggin. You can clearly see the connection between the original chessman and the characters visualized by Peter Firmin. Note particularly the similarity around the head and the way that he glances, that Noggin glances slightly to the right. I mean, it's just delightful. That's, but it's true that Noggin is given a rather more carefree expression. And just to be clear, I'm as likely to indulge in the impulse to have a laugh with the chessmen as anyone else is. And here is a slide of one of my favourite dialogues between two pieces. And in fact, Barbara and I have to admit, had a great deal of fun positioning them in November when we were installing the exhibition, because it's irresistible not to team them up. Both pieces take the position of rooks in the Lewis sets, and were not designed necessarily to be seen together, but they make such a great double act. And the character biting the top of his shield appears to be an even more deliberate masterpiece of the comic, with his great big bulging eyes and his prominent teeth that might be chattering in fear. Indeed, when it comes to provoking a smile, the warders, that is the rooks, may just win the prize, as these five amply illustrate. The two top pieces are conventional foot soldiers and are suitably equipped for battle with sword, shield, and protective headgear. Although it's true to say the one on the right seems to be wearing a bowler hat, and the one on the left something resembling a lampshade. But in fact, both do conform to the military dress of the period and are probably not intended as caricatures. Part of what makes them comic to a modern observer is that they lack feet or necks. You see, all of them are on these flat bases, and there's no evidence of any neck that connects them, the head to the shoulders. And this means that they all appear squat and rather hunched. In fact, all of the chessmen are expertly carved, and it was interesting to hear Dylan's remarks about the tactile qualities of pieces and the sort of practicalities of playing with certain pieces, because each of these are carved with considerable regard for their function as game pieces. Each of the warders show how every individual part of the carving is contained within the frame of the figure to prevent it from damage. There are no protuberant points, and the weak point that might be provided by the neck is completely avoided. And it's worth noting that some later chess pieces, where they have given the pieces have got more elegance because they're given the benefit of a neck, they've lost their heads because it's a very vulnerable point of breakage. But what about these shield biters on the bottom row? Surely we're allowed to laugh at those. Well, maybe not, because these three individuals are possibly the most significant of all the pieces, because these are the ones that fix the Lewis chessmen firmly within Norse culture. Although irresistibly comic to us, these little characters are almost certainly intended to represent fierce fighting machines. The teeth that appear to chatter in terror are an unmistakable sign that these soldiers are a specific type of warrior, the berserker. Snorri Sturluson refers to the berserkers in his saga, the Heimskringla, written in around 1230. Sturluson is writing within a Christianized society where the recent pagan past is still celebrated as a golden age of valor. He describes berserkers in the following way. The soldiers of Odin went forth to the combat without armour, raging like dogs or wolves, biting their shields, and in strength equal to furious bulls or bears. Their enemies lay prostrate at their feet, neither fire nor weapons harmed them. This frenzy was known as Berserksgänge. So not to be trifled with, that's the message there. Now, the starring role given to the queens in the Harry Potter Wizard's chess sequence reflects the great popularity of the queens among the Lewis chessmen. This, as I remarked earlier, is directly related to the fact that they look so utterly fed up. Here, all 5 of the British Museum queens are in a display of apparently unambiguous grumpiness. Each supports her chin in her hand in a manner that is almost universally interpreted by the mass of onlookers to convey boredom. 2 have objects in their left hands, one illustrated top right holds a horn, and another, bottom left, holds a length of a cloth or a veil. It's uncertain what the significance of these items might have been. The horn resembles the type of horn that operated a little like a bugle to sound an alarm in the defense of city walls or for use in hunting. It might equally be intended to represent a drinking horn. Snorri Sturluson's epic poem Edda makes reference to a horn used by a queen for the storage of money. Each of these interpretations could be equally correct. The military function of a horn to sound an alarm is entirely appropriate on the battlefield, and as Dylan demonstrated, this is exactly what the chessboard sets out. Chess is, after all, essentially a war game. The queen is part of the Christianization of the game and does not appear in either the Indian or the Islamic versions of chess. I've also cited here Marilyn Yalom's work. Marilyn's at Stanford University and published her book, The Birth of the Chess Queen, in 2004, where she sets out comprehensively the development of the queen in chess. She relates, and I think this is perfectly convincing, as Dylan also suggested, that the introduction of the queen to the game reflects the political power that the medieval queen wielded. A queen, as Henry II of England's queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, proved in the 1170s, could mobilize military forces even in opposition to her own king. So what can we deduce from the Lewis chess queen's characteristic pose? Is she disgruntled with her king? Is that why he, in turn, looks so worried? I think the clue to the Lewis chess queen's pose lies with another, more celebrated queen, the Virgin Mary, Queen of Heaven. The cast bronze figure on the right is a representation of the Virgin from a crucifixion group. It dates from the late 11th or early 12th century and would have been positioned at the foot of the cross with a figure of St. John. In this context, the pose adopted by the Lewis chess queens would appear to express sorrow. The cult of the Virgin Mary blossomed in the 12th century and had a huge impact as an exemplar for medieval queenship. The adoption of a pose associated with the grieving Virgin is almost certainly intended to convey compassion as the Lewis queens mourn for their fallen troops. This detail shows not just the identical nature of the pose, but the very close similarities in modelling. Both figures conform to the stylistic conventions represented by the Romanesque period. The term Romanesque was devised in the early 19th century as a way of defining Western European artistic activity from about the middle of the 11th century to around the early years of the 13th. The period is also known as the 12th century Renaissance, to express the notion that such a phenomenal growth of ideas had not occurred since the times of ancient Rome. Apart from minor variations in dress, beard, hair, or stance, all of the Lewis chessmen have the same facial features: prominent staring eyes, downturned mouths, and slightly protuberant upper lips. This homogeneity was quite usual in a period that did not think in terms of individual portraiture. The portrait really is an innovation of the 1300s. The backs of the seated figures' thrones display a much greater wealth of individual treatment, as is shown by this slide of the reverse of the queens. This exuberant decoration with grotesques amid fleshy tendrils are in keeping with the stylistic preoccupations of the age. They operate rather like the drawings in the margins of medieval manuscripts, which, however, do contain comic elements. But in the case of the Lewis Chessmen, there is no evidence that the carvings were designed to do anything more than to entertain the eye during what might be a very lengthy game. Early chess theorists tried to concoct different ways of speeding chess up, because some games would go on for just too long, I mean for days and days and days, as they do today, of course. And this included the introduction of dice and the developments in the different moves, such as for the queen and the bishop. So at the risk of becoming predictable in my argument, let's turn to the Homeric kings. The kings are all seated on thrones as ornate and individualized as those of their queens. Each grips a sword with both hands and rests it across his knees. The sword suggests conventional physical strength, but also implies the administration of unswerving justice. The portrayal of the king, ruling wisely and exacting justice with a firm hand, had a very long literary pedigree. As with the medieval queen's reliance on the Virgin Mary, the Christian exemplar for medieval kingship was provided by Christ himself as King of Heaven. Medieval monarchy was not a laughing matter, literally. This description of Louis the Pious by Tegan, Bishop of Trier, in 836, gives possibly a rather extreme view on what was considered appropriate behavior in a king. He never raised his voice in laughter, not even at the height of the festivities, when, to the joy of the people, actors, jesters, and mimes with flutes and sitars appeared before him. Not even as the people in his presence laughed with measure. He never even allowed his white teeth to be bared in laughter. This passage is probably more revealing about the Church's doctrinal view of laughter than about the reality, of course. Laughing with measure was acceptable, but a lack of control was seen to lead to hidden dangers. The monastic rule of Benedict condemned laughter as incompatible with prayer and saw it as an impediment to empathy with the suffering of Christ. And it was also noted by a number of scriptural theorists that the Gospels never describe Christ as breaking into a laugh. We can't deduce from this, of course, that laughter was banished from medieval society. The minstrels and jesters at the festivities enjoyed by Louis the Pious, or not enjoyed as much as he might, show that humour was indulged in. Indeed, by the 12th century, the period when the chessmen were carved, a satiric wit that could be directed against the king himself and his court had developed. This was owing mainly to the interest in the classics that flourished as part of the 12th century Renaissance, as writers used formal models inherited from the texts of Horace, Persius, and Juvenal. The satires that were produced were written in Latin and were composed for a learned audience. The authors were churchmen and were principally concerned with abuses in the church. However, a number turned their critical gaze on the rest of society, from the king downwards. Nigel of Canterbury's Mirror of Fools, written in about 1180, depicts the bad king as fickle, tyrannical, and a robber rather than a ruler. These stock complaints against the unjust king vary very little in the detail. The Lewis chess kings from the model set out by church theorists and satirists alike would, however, appear to embody the values of the virtuous monarch. Bishops come in for rather more extensive criticism from 12th century satirists, as the worldly excesses of the church were their primary target. Bishops are caricatured for neglecting their spiritual duties, preferring to live in luxury. They were characterized by the vices of sloth, gluttony, and lust, and were criticized for their love of hunting. Bernard de Morval's De Contemptu Mundi, written a little before the middle of the 12th century, describes the typical bishop in the following way. The upright bishop goes out for hares, goes hawking. The leash is removed, the wild beast sought and roused. A sleek horse adds to the splendor of his elegance. Now, the Lewis chessmen bishops show no visible signs of these worldly excesses. They stand or are seated on thrones and are furnished with croziers and occasionally Bibles. They are rather somber and pious-looking, but this is entirely in keeping with the spiritual values that they are meant to personify. Like the Queen, the bishop is introduced as part of the Christianization of the game, but emerges only in the 12th century. It has been suggested that their very appearance on the board is a satirical jibe against the worldly excesses of bishops, since the clergy were explicitly forbidden to play chess. The prominent church reformer Peter Damian describes his dismay in 1061-62 when he discovered that the Bishop of Florence had been found playing chess. He reports the discovery to the Pope and concludes, "But this we have said, that it may be known from the correction of another how shameful, how senseless, nay, how disgusting this sport is in a priest." It seems a bit harsh for a game of chess, but anyway. Ultimately, of course, Dillon alluded to the fact that chess was associated with gambling because of this introduction of dice in the game. But the argument kind of veered towards it being a worthy pursuit because it was considered to be such a game of strategy and skill. And certainly by the 13th century, the church was gradually relaxing its view on the game, and chess vocabulary was widely employed in sermons. Now, unlike bishops, knights were positively encouraged to play chess. It was seen as a means of sharpening their strategic thinking. The ability to play chess had become an important qualification for the heroes of epic poems of chivalry composed between about 1150 and 1250. Guidance on appropriate behavior, formulated in instruction manuals, were produced in large numbers in the 12th century, and some specifically promote chess as a social accomplishment, such as the Disciplina Clericalis, the clerk's instruction by Petrus Alfonsi, which cites chess as one of the 7 knightly skills. In considering the comic talents of the chessmen, I have placed these two together quite mischievously in a way. The upright knight on the right seems to be in complete opposition to his rather hapless companion on the left, who is clearly having a bit of difficulty staying on his horse. So you see how he sits at this angle and how much more agitated the drapery is here, giving a sense of movement or instability. However, as with my previous combination of the two warders, these two pieces were probably never intended to be seen together or even to occupy the same board. They have features which suggest that they were carved by different craftsmen, the modelling of the horse's jaw. This is a beautiful detail, by the way. This is wonderful. The way that the lance is carried and the drapery, as I mentioned before. The slightly precarious posture of the smaller knight is likely to be a consequence of the carver navigating the curve of the walrus tusk. So I'd just like to make a few concluding comments. Really some short points about context and style. These two figures ornament the side of the shrine of St. Gotthard in Hildesheim, Germany, and date from about the same period as the Lewis Chessmen. They depict St. Thaddeus and St. James, and although they are modelled in the same vein as the chessmen, prominent eyes, downturned mouths, etc., they rarely raise a smile from anyone. The chessmen, free from the structure of a saint's shrine, which inevitably conditions our response, and endowed with great three-dimensionality, occupy a very different place in our imaginations. They inhabit the secular world of leisure and play, and this undoubtedly contributes to the responses they elicit from a modern public. Their gloomy little faces are not intended as an expression of inner angst, but are simply part and parcel of the stylistic considerations that govern their manufacture. Now, from the evidence provided by the visual arts, it appears that no one breaks into a smile much before the 13th century, when this beaming angel from Reims Cathedral was erected to decorate a doorway. And this angel was placed on the ceiling of Henry III's painted chamber in Westminster between about 1263 and 1266. Earlier in 1240, Henry documented the courtly fashion for smiling angels by insisting that 2 angels carved for the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London should have cheerful and joyous countenances. But to end on a rather more somber note, we should also consider the game of chess itself as the defining context for our understanding of the chessmen. As noted, it is a battle game, and the pursuit of it has generated famous feuds in chess even into the modern age. Few were probably as lively as this, illustrated by Renaud de Montauban between about 1462 and 1470 from a manuscript illumination at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This is probably the ultimate depiction of chess rage. The figure on the left is actually receiving a fatal blow from a sword, while the young man on the right is wielding a chessboard as a weapon. From its very inception, chess was played in earnest, and emotions ran high for those involved in the game. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written in about 1230, describes a historic event involving a game of chess between King Canute and Earl Ulfr. And when King Canute and Ulfr the Jarl were playing chess, the king made a bad move, and the Jarl then took a knight from him. The king put his men back and said he would play another move. The Jarl grew angry and threw down the chessboard. Now, sadly, the story doesn't end with this tantrum. The saga goes on to relate how Canute had Ulfr murdered the very next day. And the list goes on. In the 13th century, court records from the city of Bristol document how a certain Juliana was winning a game of chess against her male opponent when he promptly withdrew his sword and struck her in the thigh. She died of her injuries. So much for chivalry. So really, to conclude, chess, then as now, is not played for laughs. Thank you very much.